Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are diving deep into a really fascinating clash of religious worldviews. We're going to be breaking down the text, Christian critique of Hindu sexual imagery and morality, to explore a pretty profound conflict over art, divinity, and, yes, sex.
And really, this question is at the very heart of the whole thing. It's a major theological disagreement that we're going to unpack today, a real clash of perspectives on where divinity ends and where the profane begins.
So, here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the big picture, that clash of worldviews. Then, we'll get into the stories of the gods themselves. After that, we'll look at some very controversial sacred art, the symbols used in worship, and finally, we'll wrap up by looking at the core disagreements on what purity even means.
Okay, so let's jump right into that central conflict. This first point really sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about.
According to our source material, the critique really hones in on specific parts of some Hindu traditions. We're talking about their mythology, their temple art, and their rituals. From the critic's point of view, these elements just don't square with the moral framework laid out in the Bible.
All right, now let's see how the actual stories of the gods get interpreted through these completely different moral lenses.
The source points to some divine relationships in Hindu texts that Christian apologists, people who defend the faith, argue are in direct conflict with biblical law. The story of Brahma and Saraswati is a perfect example. It's often highlighted as a major clash over what's considered acceptable when it comes to family and sexual boundaries.
And this slide shows another key example used in the critique. The stories of Krishna and the gopis, which are really central to some Hindu traditions, are seen by critics as portraying acts like adultery. And that, of course, is a world away from the kind of moral purity expected of a divine figure in the biblical tradition.
So moving on from mythology and stories, the critique then turns to physical objects and art. And now we get to the world-famous and pretty controversial temple carvings of India.
Our source material really focuses heavily on these sites in particular. You could say that for Christian critics, the explicit art on these temples is basically Exhibit A in this whole theological debate.
And this is where you see a huge difference in interpretation. While many Hindu traditions see these carvings as symbolic, representing the union of the human with the divine or the joyful creative forces of the universe, the Christian critics cited in our source see a very public display of acts that are explicitly condemned by their own scripture. This quote from the source really gets to the heart of the objection. From this viewpoint, sacred spaces, actual places of worship, are being used to not just show, but to celebrate and basically immortalize what they would define as immorality.
This critique of the art flows naturally into the next point, which is about the actual objects and symbols used in worship itself.
Okay, so first, just to make sure we're all on the same page, our source defines the lingam. It's an abstract symbol of the deity Shiva, often seen as a phallus, representing divine creative energy.
And its counterpart is the yoni, which symbolizes the goddess Shakti and that divine generative power. When they're together, they represent the union of masculine and feminine energies, the totality of creation.
So here's the crucial point of conflict. It's all about interpretation and veneration. What one tradition sees as a representation of sacred, cosmic creation, the Christian critique views as a form of idolatry that puts human anatomy on a divine pedestal and, in doing so, flips biblical norms about modesty and worship on their head.
And that brings us to our final section, where we're going to summarize these core philosophical and moral disagreements when it comes to purity, divinity, and the human body.
The Christian perspective, as laid out in the source, is really rooted in some very clear scriptural commands. Passages, just like this one from 1 Corinthians, create a framework of strict guidelines for sexual conduct, putting a huge emphasis on purity and reserving sex for the very specific context of marriage.
This table does a fantastic job of pulling it all together. On one side, you've got the Christian objection, and on the other, the specific Hindu practice it's talking about. It really summarizes every point of conflict we've covered, from the myths and the art to the ritual objects. And that final point, about blurring the sacred and profane, that even touches on spiritual paths like the Tantric tradition, which explicitly explores spirituality through the physical body.
So ultimately, the takeaway from the source material is pretty stark. The argument being made isn't just about having different tastes in art or slight variations in mythology. No, it's presented as a direct and maybe even irreconcilable conflict of core moral and religious values between these two worldviews.
And that leaves us with a final, really thought-provoking question to chew on. Who gets to draw that line?
and how do different cultures, different faiths, and even different individuals decide for themselves what is holy, what is art, and what is forbidden.